Welcome, dear listener, to another quiet wander through the pages of history. Tonight, we'll be exploring a forgotten chapter of ancient life, one that still echoes softly through time. Whether you're settling in with a warm drink or already wrapped in blankets, thank you for letting my voice keep you company tonight. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you listening from and what time of day is it for you? Are you hearing this as the sun rises, or are you like me, surrounded by the hush of nighttime? If the idea of gentle stories from long ago helps ease your mind, I'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe. There are many more journeys waiting for us just beyond the veil of sleep. Picture, if you will, the American frontier in the 1880s. A vast expanse of rolling plains stretches endlessly under a scorching sun, broken only by the occasional mesa rising like a monument to some forgotten god. The air shimmers with heat waves, and tumbleweeds dance across the barren landscape, pushed by winds that carry the scent of sage and dust. In the distance, a lone rider emerges from the haze, his silhouette wavering like a mirage against the horizon. This is the Wild West we know from countless films and novels, but the reality was far more brutal than any Hollywood production could capture. The men who chose the outlaw life weren't the romantic figures of legend. They were desperate souls, driven to banditry by circumstances that would break lesser men. Some were Confederate soldiers who returned from the Civil War to find their homes destroyed and their families scattered. Others were immigrants who discovered that the promised land of America offered nothing but backbreaking labor for starvation wages. Many were simply young men with no prospects, no education, and no hope of a legitimate future in a society that seemed designed to crush the weak underfoot. Consider the story of Frank Morrison, a fictional but entirely typical bandit of the era. Born in Missouri in 1855 to a family of sharecroppers, Frank watched his father work himself to death trying to pay off debts that seemed to grow larger with each passing season. When Frank was 16, a drought wiped out their crops, and the bank foreclosed on their small farm. His mother died of consumption that winter, unable to afford proper medical care. With nothing left to lose, Frank drifted west, carrying only a worn-out Colt revolver that had belonged to his father, and a burning resentment against a world that had shown him nothing but cruelty. The transformation from desperate young man to hardened outlaw didn't happen overnight. Frank's first crime was stealing a horse from a wealthy rancher who owned thousands of acres, while families like Frank's starved. The theft was born of necessity rather than greed. Frank needed transportation to reach the next town where he hoped to find work. But once you crossed that line, once you became a wanted man, there was rarely a way back to respectability. The life of a bandit was one of constant movement and perpetual fear. They slept with one eye open, never knowing when a posse might appear on the horizon or when a fellow outlaw might decide that the bounty on their head was worth more than their partnership. They lived off whatever they could steal or extort from travelers unlucky enough to cross their path. Meals were irregular and often consisted of hardtack, beans, and whatever game they could shoot without drawing attention to their location. Frank quickly learned that survival meant trusting no one completely. Even within outlaw gangs, betrayal was common. Partners would turn on each other for a larger share of stolen goods, or simply to collect the reward money that seemed to follow every bandit like a shadow. The bonds between outlaws were forged in shared danger, but could be broken just as easily by greed or desperation. The physical toll of the outlaw life was immense. Days spent in the saddle under the merciless sun left men weathered and prematurely aged. Their hands became calloused from gripping reins and weapons, their backs permanently bent from sleeping on hard ground. Many developed chronic pain from old gunshot wounds that had healed poorly without proper medical attention. Dental problems were rampant, as were various diseases picked up from contaminated water sources and poor sanitation. Frank's gang, like most outlaw groups, operated from remote hideouts in Badlands that offered natural protection from pursuit. These camps were Spartan affairs, consisting of little more than lean-to shelters and fire pits that had to be carefully concealed to avoid detection. The men lived like wolves, constantly alert for danger and ready to abandon their temporary homes at a moment's notice. The psychological pressure was perhaps even more devastating than the physical hardships. The constant stress of being hunted took its toll on men's minds. Many outlaws turned to alcohol or laudanum to numb their fears, creating new problems that only made their situations more desperate. Paranoia was common, as was depression. Some men simply couldn't handle the isolation and would surrender to authorities, preferring the certainty of prison or execution to the endless uncertainty of life on the run. Frank witnessed firsthand how the outlaw life destroyed men from the inside out. He watched strong, proud men reduced to trembling shadows of themselves, jumping at every sound and seeing enemies in every stranger's face. Some lost their minds entirely, talking to themselves or to long-dead companions. Others became increasingly violent and unpredictable, lashing out at anyone who crossed them. The romanticized image of the gentleman bandit was largely a myth. While some outlaws like Jesse James cultivated public personas as folk heroes fighting against corrupt railroads and banks, the reality was far more sordid. Most bandits were brutal men who thought nothing of killing anyone who stood between them and their goals. They robbed not just banks and trains, but also stagecoaches carrying ordinary travelers, often leaving their victims destitute or dead. Frank's first kill came during a botched stagecoach robbery when he was 19. A passenger, an elderly drummer selling patent medicines, tried to protect a small bag of coins that represented his life savings. In the confusion and adrenaline of the moment, Frank's gun went off, and the old man fell backward with a look of surprise frozen on his face. The memory of that moment would haunt Frank for the rest of his short life, appearing in his dreams and reminding him of how far he had fallen from the frightened farm boy he had once been. The law enforcement of the era was often as brutal as the outlaws they pursued. Sheriffs and marshals were typically former gunfighters themselves, men who had chosen to work within the system rather than against it. They showed little mercy to captured bandits, and many outlaws were shot down during attempted arrests rather than being brought to trial. The concept of due process was often ignored in favor of swift frontier justice. Posses formed to hunt outlaws were usually composed of local citizens with varying degrees of skill and motivation. Some were motivated by a genuine desire to see justice done, while others were drawn by the reward money offered for dead or alive capture of wanted men. These groups could be relentless in their pursuit, tracking outlaws for weeks or even months across vast distances. Frank learned to read the signs that indicated a posse was closing in. Fresh horse tracks, distant dust clouds, and the sudden silence of wildlife all warned of approaching danger. When pursuit became too intense, outlaws would split up, hoping to confuse their hunters and improve their individual chances of escape. These separations often became permanent, as scattered gang members would either be captured or would decide to try their luck elsewhere. The weapons that outlaws carried were tools of survival rather than symbols of power. Frank's Colt revolver was a practical choice, reliable and quick to reload, but accuracy suffered beyond close range. Many bandits also carried rifles for longer distance work, usually lever-action Winchester models that could fire multiple shots without reloading. Ammunition was expensive and sometimes hard to come by, so every shot had to count. Gunfights, contrary to popular depictions, were usually chaotic affairs lasting only seconds. Most took place at close range, often in poor lighting conditions. Accuracy was less important than speed, and many gunfights were decided by luck as much as skill. Frank survived several such encounters, but he knew that his luck wouldn't last forever. Every bandit understood that their life would likely end violently. either in a shootout with lawmen or at the end of a rope. The isolation of outlaw life was perhaps its cruelest aspect. Cut off from family and friends, bandits lived in a world where genuine human connection was rare and dangerous. They couldn't trust strangers, couldn't settle down, and couldn't build the relationships that make life meaningful. Frank often thought about his childhood sweetheart, Mary, wondering if she had married and started a family while he was running from the law. Such thoughts were both comforting and torturous, reminding him of the normal life he had sacrificed for a path of violence and desperation. Women in the outlaw world occupied a complex position. Some, like Belle Starr, became bandits themselves, proving just as capable of violence as their male counterparts. Others served as accomplices, providing safe houses and information while maintaining the facade of respectability. Many were victims, forced into relationships with outlaws or caught in the crossfire of their violent activities. Frank encountered few women during his outlaw years, and those he did meet were usually in frontier towns where his gang stopped to resupply. These brief interactions reminded him of the gentler aspects of civilization that he had abandoned. A shopkeeper's daughter who smiled at him while selling supplies, or a saloon girl who listened to his troubles without judgment, could make him question his chosen path and wonder what might have been. The economic realities of banditry were far from glamorous. While successful bank or train robberies might yield substantial sums, the money had to be split among gang members and was often quickly spent on necessities like food, ammunition, and fresh horses. Outlaws couldn't invest their gains or save for the future, as they never knew when they might need to abandon everything and flee. The lifestyle was inherently wasteful, with stolen money flowing through their hands like water. Frank's gang once robbed a Union Pacific train carrying a railroad payroll, netting over $3,000 in gold and currency. It seemed like a fortune to men who had been living on stolen chickens and stale bread. But within a month, the money was gone. New horses to replace those that had gone lame. Bribes to corrupt officials who looked the other way. Medical supplies for a wounded gang member. And the simple living expenses had consumed their windfall, leaving them as desperate as before. The railroad companies and banks that were frequent targets of outlaw activity fought back with increasing sophistication. They hired private detectives like the Pinkerton Agency, who pursued criminals with a dedication that surpassed most local law enforcement. These professional manhunters had resources and connections that allowed them to track outlaws across state lines and coordinate with multiple jurisdictions. Frank's gang found themselves pursued by a Pinkerton detective named Samuel Morrison, no relation despite the shared surname. Morrison was a methodical man who studied his quarry like a scientist, learning their habits and preferences. He tracked them not just by following their trail, but by understanding their psychology and predicting their next moves. This cat-and-mouse game added another layer of stress to an already difficult existence. The changing nature of the frontier also worked against the outlaw lifestyle. As settlements grew and communication improved, there were fewer places to hide, and more people who might recognize wanted men. Telegraph lines allowed news of crimes to travel faster than the criminals themselves, alerting authorities in distant towns to be on the lookout for specific individuals. Frank noticed these changes as the 1880s progressed. Towns that had been lawless frontier settlements when he first arrived now had proper sheriffs, judges, and jails. The railroad brought not just progress, but also easier transportation for law enforcement. What had once been a vast, empty landscape was becoming increasingly civilized, leaving less and less room for men like him. As we delve deeper into Frank's story and the brutal realities of bandit life in the Wild West, we begin to understand that the romantic mythology surrounding these figures obscures a much darker truth. These were men caught in a cycle of violence and desperation, living lives that were far more miserable than they were exciting. The frontier may have offered freedom from the constraints of civilized society, but for outlaws, that freedom came at a terrible price. The daily routine of a bandit was governed by survival rather than choice. Frank and his companions would rise before dawn, not from any desire to greet the day, but because traveling in the early morning hours offered the best chance of avoiding detection. The pre-dawn darkness provided cover, and the cool air was easier on both men and horses than the scorching heat of midday. Breakfast, when there was any, consisted of whatever could be prepared quickly and without much smoke. Cold beans from a can, hardtack that had to be soaked in water to be edible, and occasionally strips of jerky cut from stolen cattle. Coffee was a luxury that required a fire, and fires meant smoke that could be seen for miles across the flat prairie. More often than not, the gang would chew tobacco or suck on peppermint candies to ward off hunger and thirst until they could safely stop to eat. The horses were always the first priority. Without their mounts, outlaws were as good as dead. Frank learned to read the signs of equine fatigue and illness, knowing that a lame horse could mean the difference between escape and capture. They would steal fresh horses whenever possible, but good animals were valuable and well guarded. More often, they made do with whatever they could find, constantly pushing their mounts to the edge of exhaustion. Water was another constant concern. The arid landscape of much of the West meant that water sources were scarce and often contaminated. Outlaws had to know the location of every spring, creek, and waterhole in their territory. But they also had to assume that these places might be watched by law enforcement. Many times, Frank's gang went days with only a few mouthfuls of warm, stale water from their canteens. The psychological toll of constant vigilance cannot be overstated. Every dust cloud on the horizon might be a posse. Every stranger in a saloon might be a bounty hunter. Every sound in the night might herald an attack. Frank found himself unable to relax completely, even during supposedly safe moments. His hand would instinctively move toward his gun at unexpected noises, and he slept with his boots on, ready to run at a moment's notice. The isolation wore on all of them differently. Some men became increasingly quiet and withdrawn, speaking only when necessary. Others became compulsively talkative, filling the silence with rambling stories and observations. A few developed nervous habits, constantly checking their weapons or scanning the horizon. Frank noticed that he had begun talking to his horse, carrying on one-sided conversations that helped combat the loneliness but made him worry about his own sanity. Medical care was virtually non-existent for outlaws. A bullet wound might be treated with whiskey and a dirty bandana, with the patient having to hope that infection didn't set in. Frank watched a fellow gang member die slowly from gangrene after being shot in the leg during a botched bank robbery. The man's agonized cries echoed through their camp for 3 days before he finally succumbed, and they buried him in an unmarked grave in the Badlands. Dental problems were common and excruciating. Without access to dentists, outlaws suffered through toothaches that could last for weeks. Some would attempt to extract their own teeth using whatever tools were available, often causing more damage than relief. Frank had lost several teeth to decay and violence by his mid-20s, giving him the gaunt, weathered appearance common to men of his profession. The clothing and equipment of outlaws reflected their harsh lifestyle. Garments became patched and repatched until they were more mend than original fabric. Boots wore through quickly from constant riding and walking on rough terrain, and replacement footwear was often ill-fitting and uncomfortable. Frank's hat, originally black, had faded to a dusty brown from sun exposure and was held together with wire where the crown had separated from the brim. Personal hygiene was another casualty of outlaw life. Opportunities for bathing were rare, and soap was a luxury that few could afford. Frank and his companions often went weeks without washing, their clothes stiff with sweat and grime. The smell was overpowering, a mixture of unwashed bodies, horse sweat, gun oil, and tobacco. They became so accustomed to their own stench that they barely noticed it, but it marked them as outsiders whenever they ventured into civilized company. The relationship between outlaws and the communities they preyed upon was complex and often contradictory. While most citizens feared and despised bandits, there were always those willing to profit from their presence. Corrupt merchants would sell supplies at inflated prices, asking no questions about their customers' identities. Saloon keepers and brothel madams provided services while maintaining plausible deniability about their patrons' occupations. Frank learned to identify these willing collaborators, often through subtle signs and coded language. A particular way of displaying goods in a store window might indicate that the proprietor was open to illegal business. Certain phrases or gestures could communicate one's outlaw status without explicitly stating it. This underground network of corruption and complicity was essential to bandit survival, but also demonstrated how the lawlessness of the frontier had infected even supposedly respectable society. The territorial governments and emerging state authorities were gradually extending their reach into previously lawless regions, but their efforts were often hampered by corruption, incompetence, and simple lack of resources. Sheriffs might be honest lawmen, genuinely trying to bring order to their communities, or they might be political appointees, more interested in personal profit than public service. Frank had encountered both types and learned to read the signs that indicated which kind of lawman he was dealing with. Some sheriffs could be bought off with sufficient bribes, while others were incorruptible and would pursue outlaws relentlessly. The worst were those who played both sides, taking money from criminals while maintaining their official positions. These men were unpredictable and dangerous, likely to betray anyone if the price was right or if their own positions were threatened. The federal government was also beginning to take a more active role in frontier law enforcement. US Marshals had jurisdiction across territorial boundaries and were often more professional and better equipped than local officials. They were also harder to corrupt and more likely to coordinate their efforts with other agencies. Frank's gang found themselves increasingly pursued by federal authorities as their crimes drew more attention. The Pinkerton Detective Agency represented the cutting edge of criminal investigation in the 1880s. Founded by Alan Pinkerton in Chicago, the agency employed former law enforcement officers and military veterans who brought professional methods to the pursuit of criminals. They maintained detailed files on known outlaws, including photographs when available, physical descriptions, and information about associates and known hideouts. Frank first became aware of Pinkerton interest when wanted posters bearing his likeness began appearing in towns throughout the territory. The sketch was remarkably accurate, based on descriptions provided by witnesses to various crimes. Seeing his face on a poster with a substantial reward offered for his capture dead or alive was a sobering reminder that his freedom was temporary and that powerful forces were working to end his criminal career. The psychological warfare employed by professional manhunters was often as effective as their physical pursuit. They would spread rumors designed to create distrust among gang members, sometimes claiming that one outlaw had agreed to betray his companions in exchange for leniency. These tactics succeeded in breaking up many criminal organizations, as paranoia and suspicion destroyed the bonds that held them together. Frank watched his own gang slowly disintegrate under this pressure. Men who had once trusted each other with their lives began to view their companions with suspicion. Arguments became more frequent and more violent. The camaraderie that had made their harsh existence bearable gradually gave way to mutual hostility and fear. The economic depression of the 1870s had created conditions that drove many men to outlawry. But as the decade progressed and the economy improved, legitimate opportunities became more available. Some bandits managed to abandon their criminal careers and disappear into respectable society, but this required careful planning, and often the cooperation of sympathetic citizens willing to provide false identities and references. Frank occasionally considered attempting such a transformation, but realized that his face was too well known and his crimes too serious for easy forgiveness. The murders he had committed, even in self-defense or the heat of robbery, marked him as beyond redemption in the eyes of the law. There would be no quiet retirement to a small farm or anonymous job in a distant city. His path had led to a dead end from which there was no honorable escape. The technological advances of the era also worked against outlaws in ways they often failed to appreciate. The expansion of telegraph networks meant that news of crimes could travel faster than the criminals themselves. A bank robbery in one town could be reported to authorities hundreds of miles away within hours, allowing them to set up roadblocks and search parties along likely escape routes. Photography was becoming more common and more sophisticated, making it easier to create accurate wanted posters and to identify suspects. Frank had been photographed without his knowledge during a visit to a frontier studio, and that image had been distributed to law enforcement agencies throughout the region. The idea that his face could be captured and reproduced indefinitely was disturbing and made him feel exposed and vulnerable. The railroad companies, frequent targets of outlaw activity, began implementing security measures specifically designed to thwart bandits. Express cars carrying valuable cargo were reinforced and equipped with armed guards. Train schedules were varied to make it harder for criminals to plan robberies. Some companies even employed their own detective forces to investigate crimes and pursue perpetrators. Frank's gang had attempted to rob a Union Pacific Express train, only to discover that the car they targeted was defended by 6 armed guards equipped with repeating rifles. The resulting gunfight was brief but devastating, leaving 2 gang members dead and Frank himself wounded in the shoulder. They escaped with nothing but bitter experience and the knowledge that their methods were becoming obsolete. As the frontier era drew to a close, the romantic mythology of the outlaw began to take shape, even as the reality became increasingly grim. Dime novels and newspaper accounts often portrayed bandits as misunderstood heroes fighting against corrupt authority. But these fictional portrayals bore little resemblance to the desperate, brutal men that Frank knew himself and his companions to be. The gap between myth and reality was perhaps most evident in the public's fascination with famous outlaws like Jesse James and Billy the Kid. These men were elevated to folk hero status by writers and journalists who emphasized their supposed nobility while glossing over the violence and cruelty that mark their actual careers. Frank found this romanticization both amusing and insulting, as it trivialized the genuine suffering that the outlaw life entailed. As we continue to explore the brutal realities of bandit life in the Wild West, we see that Frank Morrison's story, while fictional, represents the experiences of countless men who chose or were forced onto the outlaw trail. Their lives were characterized not by adventure and excitement, but by fear, privation, and the constant awareness that death or capture lurked around every corner. The mythology of the Wild West outlaw may continue to captivate our imagination, but the truth was far more sobering than any legend could convey. Looking at your previous script and the reference materials, I'll continue with part 2 of Boring History, the brutal life of a bandit in the Wild West. Here's the continuation. The harsh reality of Frank Morrison's new existence became apparent within days of joining the gang. Gone were any romantic notions of noble outlaws fighting injustice. What he found instead was a group of desperate men, most of them former Confederate soldiers who had returned from the war to find their farms burned, their families scattered, and their futures erased. Others were immigrants who had been promised prosperity in America, only to discover that survival required skills they had never learned. The gang's hideout was a collection of ramshackle lean-tos and dugouts carved into a rocky canyon wall, hidden deep in the Badlands of New Mexico territory. The smell was overwhelming. Unwashed bodies, rotting food scraps, and human waste created a miasma that hung over the camp like a permanent fog. Water was scarce and precious, reserved for drinking rather than washing. Most of the men hadn't bathed in months, their clothes stiff with dried sweat and grime. Frank's first lesson in outlaw life came when he watched a fellow gang member die from an infected gunshot wound. The man, a former Union soldier named Pete Kowalski, had taken a bullet in the leg during their last robbery 3 weeks earlier. Without proper medical care, the wound had festered and turned gangrenous. Frank watched helplessly as Pete's fever spiked and his leg turned black. The man screamed for 2 days before finally succumbing to blood poisoning. They buried Pete in a shallow grave, marked only by a pile of rocks. No words were spoken over the grave. Death was too common an occurrence to warrant ceremony. Frank realized that this would likely be his own fate someday, forgotten and unmarked in some desolate corner of the frontier. The daily routine of bandit life was far from exciting. Most days were spent in hiding, waiting for information about potential targets. The men would sit around their meager campfires, playing cards with worn decks, drinking rot-gut whiskey when they could afford it, and arguing over trivial matters that sometimes escalated into violence. Frank witnessed 2 men nearly kill each other over a disputed card game, their knives flashing in the firelight as the others formed a circle to watch. Food was always a problem. The gang survived on whatever they could steal, hunt, or scavenge. Meals typically consisted of hardtack biscuits so tough they had to be soaked in water to be edible, strips of jerky that might have been beef or horse, and weak coffee made from grounds that had been used multiple times. Fresh meat was rare, usually obtained by shooting rabbits or prairie dogs. Frank learned to eat anything that wouldn't poison him, including cactus fruit and prairie grass when times were particularly lean. The psychological toll was perhaps worse than the physical hardships. Frank found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, jumping at every unexpected sound. Trust was a luxury none of them could afford. Gang members regularly disappeared in the night, either deserting or, in some cases, selling information to the authorities in exchange for leniency. Frank learned to sleep with one eye open and his gun within easy reach. The gang's leader, a man known only as Blackjack Ketchum, ruled through fear and intimidation. He was quick to violence and had killed more than one gang member who had challenged his authority or failed to follow orders. Blackjack had fought in the Civil War and claimed to have ridden with Quantrill's raiders, though Frank suspected this was likely a lie designed to enhance his reputation. What wasn't a lie was his capacity for cruelty. Frank watched him beat a man unconscious for questioning a robbery plan, then leave him tied to a tree for the buzzards. The actual robberies were nothing like the dime novels portrayed them. There was no honor among thieves, no careful planning, no clever schemes. Most jobs were desperate, poorly planned affairs that relied more on luck than skill. Frank's first robbery was a stagecoach carrying mail and a few passengers between small frontier towns. The gang waited in ambush behind a cluster of boulders, their horses hidden in a nearby arroyo. When the stage appeared, Blackjack gave the signal and they charged out, guns blazing and shouting like banshees. The driver tried to whip his horses into a run, but the team was tired and the coach was heavily loaded. Frank's heart pounded as he rode alongside the swaying vehicle, trying to aim his pistol while controlling his horse. The whole affair was chaos and terror. The passengers, a traveling salesman and an elderly woman, cowered inside the coach as the outlaws brought it to a halt. Frank was sickened by the woman's tears as they rifled through her belongings, taking her wedding ring and the few dollars she carried. The salesman's sample case yielded nothing of value except some cheap jewelry and a bottle of patent medicine. The mail sacks contained mostly letters and newspapers, worthless to the gang. The entire haul amounted to less than $40 and some personal items they could never sell. For this meager prize, they had risked their lives and traumatized innocent people. Worse still, they had left witnesses who could identify them to the authorities. Frank realized that banditry was not just morally wrong, but also economically foolish. a man could make more money in a week of honest work than most robberies yielded. The aftermath of the robbery brought new terrors. Within days, posses were scouring the territory, following their trail and questioning anyone who might have seen them. The gang was forced to split up and ride hard for their hideout, covering their tracks as best they could. They rode for 18 hours straight, stopping only to rest their horses. Frank's legs were raw from the saddle, and his back ached from constantly looking over his shoulder for pursuing lawmen. Even worse than local posses were the professional manhunters. The Pinkerton Detective Agency had agents throughout the West, men who made their living tracking down outlaws. These were not amateur lawmen or glory-seeking sheriffs, but experienced professionals who knew how to read sign, how to think like criminals, and how to be patient. They had resources that local law enforcement lacked, including telegraph networks that could spread information faster than any horse could travel. Frank learned that Alan Pinkerton's men had been responsible for breaking up the James Younger gang and had tracked down numerous other outlaw groups. They used innovative techniques like photography to circulate wanted posters, coordinated with railroad companies and banks to gather intelligence, and maintained detailed files on known criminals and their associates. For men like Frank, the Pinkertons represented an almost supernatural threat, an invisible network that could reach anywhere and strike without warning. The constant stress of being hunted took its toll on every member of the gang. Men aged years in months, their hair turning grey and their faces becoming lined with worry. Some turned to alcohol or laudanum to cope with the pressure, becoming unreliable and dangerous. Others became increasingly paranoid, seeing enemies in every shadow and suspecting betrayal in every conversation. Frank witnessed the gang's gradual disintegration as the pressures mounted. Men who had once been loyal companions began to eye each other with suspicion. Arguments became more frequent and more violent. The group's cohesion, never strong to begin with, began to fracture completely. Some members talked openly of surrendering to the authorities, while others spoke of heading to Mexico or Canada to escape the law's reach. The winter of 1884 was particularly brutal. Holed up in their canyon hideout, the gang faced temperatures that dropped well below freezing. Their shelter was inadequate, and fuel for fires was scarce. Frank nearly lost 2 toes to frostbite, and 1 gang member died of pneumonia. They survived by huddling together for warmth and burning anything that would ignite, including furniture stolen from their last raid and pages torn from books. Food became even scarcer during the winter months. Game was hard to find, and the gang's dwindling funds couldn't stretch to buy adequate supplies. Frank learned what true hunger felt like, the gnawing emptiness that made it impossible to think about anything except food. He dreamed of his mother's cooking, of hot bread and thick stew, luxuries that seemed impossibly distant from his current reality. It was during this desperate winter that Frank witnessed the final breakdown of whatever honor might have existed among the outlaws. When supplies ran critically low, Blackjack ordered a raid on a nearby homestead, occupied by a family with young children. Frank watched in horror as his companions terrorized the family, taking their meager food stores and leaving them to face the winter with nothing. The children's cries haunted Frank for weeks afterward, a reminder of how far he had fallen from the man he had once hoped to become. The raid on the homestead proved to be a fatal mistake. The family's patriarch, though intimidated during the robbery, managed to provide detailed descriptions of the gang to the local sheriff. Within a week, a large posse supported by federal marshals was closing in on their hideout. The gang's long run of relative safety was about to come to an end. Frank realized that his life as an outlaw had become a nightmare from which there seemed to be no escape. He was trapped between the law, which would show him no mercy if caught, and his fellow outlaws, who would likely kill him if they suspected he was considering surrender. Every day brought new dangers and new reasons to despair. The romantic vision of the outlaw life had been replaced by a brutal reality of violence, deprivation, and moral compromise. As he sat by the dying embers of their campfire that winter night, listening to the wind howl through the canyon and watching his companions sleep fitfully with their weapons close at hand, Frank Morrison understood that he had become something he had never intended to be. He was no longer the hopeful young man who had set out to make his fortune in the West. He was a hunted animal, living from day to day with no future beyond the next robbery or the next flight from pursuing lawmen. The transformation was complete, but it had brought him nothing except misery, fear, and the growing certainty that his story would end badly. In the morning, he would have to make a choice that would determine whether he lived or died, whether he found redemption or continued his descent into a hell of his own making. The brutal life of a bandit in the Wild West had claimed another victim, and Frank Morrison was beginning to understand that some choices, once made, could never be undone. The myth of the noble outlaw was exactly that, a myth. The reality was far darker, far more desperate, and far more human than any dime novel had ever dared to portray. Frank Morrison's calloused hands trembled as he crouched behind the rocky outcropping, the bitter Wyoming wind cutting through his threadbare coat like a knife. 3 days without food, and the posse's horses were getting closer. The romantic tales of noble outlaws that would one day fill dime novels bore no resemblance to the wretched reality of his existence. Just 18 months earlier, Frank had been a different man entirely. The son of a Missouri farmer, he'd returned from the war between the states to find his family's land stripped bare, his parents dead from cholera, and creditors circling like vultures. The banks had foreclosed on everything, leaving him with nothing but the clothes on his back and a growing bitterness toward a world that seemed designed to crush men like him. The transformation from farm boy to bandit hadn't happened overnight. It began with desperation, stealing food from merchant wagons just to survive another day. Then came the inevitable progression, joining up with other desperate men who'd been pushed beyond the breaking point by circumstances beyond their control. What started as survival became a way of life, though calling it a life was generous. The reality of bandit existence was a far cry from the tales that would later romanticize the Wild West. Frank's gang, if you could call their ragged band of 6 men a gang, lived like animals. They made camp in caves, abandoned mine shafts, and hidden canyons where the law couldn't easily follow. Their beds were rocky ground, their blankets whatever they could steal or scavenge. Sleep came in fitful bursts, always with one ear listening for the sound of approaching horses. Food was whatever they could take at gunpoint or find growing wild. Hardtack crawling with weevils, jerky so tough it barely qualified as meat, beans that had to be soaked for hours just to become edible. Frank had lost 30 pounds since taking to the outlaw trail, his once sturdy frame now gaunt and hollow-eyed. His teeth were beginning to loosen from poor nutrition, and a persistent cough racked his chest from nights spent sleeping in damp caves. Water was an even greater challenge than food. Clean sources were rare, and the alkaline water they often found in desert springs left them sick for days. Frank had watched 2 men in his gang die from drinking contaminated water, their bodies racked with fever and dysentery as they slowly wasted away in some god-forsaken canyon. The survivors had been forced to bury them in shallow graves, marked only by piles of stones that would be scattered by the first good storm. The violence that defined their existence wasn't the quick, clean gunfights depicted in later fiction. It was brutal, desperate, and often senseless. Frank had killed 4 men since becoming an outlaw, though he tried not to think about their faces in the dark hours before dawn. The first had been a stagecoach guard who'd gone for his weapon when Frank's gang attempted their robbery. The man had been young, probably not much older than Frank himself, and he died slowly, clutching his belly as blood seeped between his fingers. Each robbery was a roll of the dice with death. They targeted stagecoaches, isolated homesteads, and small-town banks, but their methods were crude and their planning poor. They had no inside information, No carefully orchestrated schemes. Instead, they relied on desperation and the element of surprise, rushing in with guns blazing and hoping for the best. More often than not, they came away with little to show for their efforts, except wanted posters bearing their likenesses. The psychological toll was perhaps worse than the physical hardships. Frank found himself jumping at shadows, unable to trust even his fellow outlaws. Paranoia became a constant companion as he watched for signs of betrayal among his own men. The bonds that had initially held their group together, forged in shared desperation and common purpose, began to fray under the constant stress of their hunted existence. Sleep brought no relief, only nightmares filled with the faces of the dead and the thunder of pursuing hooves. Frank would wake in cold sweats, his hand instinctively reaching for the Colt revolver that never left his side. The weapon had become an extension of himself, its weight both a comfort and a reminder of how far he'd fallen from the life he'd once known. The law was closing in with each passing day. The Pinkerton Detective Agency had put their best men on the case, relentless pursuers who seemed to materialize from thin air whenever Frank's gang thought they'd found safety. These weren't the bumbling local sheriffs they'd initially outrun, but professional manhunters with resources and determination that matched their own desperation. Frank's gang had started with 8 men. Now only 3 remained. 2 had been killed in a botched bank robbery in a Colorado mining town, their bodies left bleeding in the dust as the survivors fled into the mountains. Another had simply disappeared one night, taking his share of their meager loot and vanishing into the darkness. Frank suspected he'd either been killed by rivals or had decided to try his luck elsewhere, but he'd never know for sure. The remaining members of the gang were showing signs of cracking under the pressure. Jake Thornton, a former Confederate soldier who'd joined them 6 months earlier, had developed a nervous tic that made his left eye twitch constantly. He jumped at every sound and had taken to talking to himself in whispered conversations that made the others uneasy. Tom Bradley, the oldest of their group at 35, had started drinking heavily whenever they could get their hands on whiskey, becoming increasingly unpredictable and violent. Their most recent robbery had been a disaster. They'd attempted to hold up a Wells Fargo stagecoach carrying a mining company payroll, but the coach had been better defended than expected. A shootout ensued that left one passenger dead, and Frank with a bullet graze across his ribs that still hadn't properly healed. They'd escaped with less than $50, barely enough to keep them fed for a week. The wound in Frank's side had become infected, the flesh around it red and swollen despite his attempts to clean it with whiskey. He could feel fever building in his system, and he knew that without proper medical attention, he might not survive another week. But doctors asked questions, and questions led to wanted posters and telegraph messages to law enforcement agencies across the territory. As the sound of the posse grew closer, Frank reflected on the choices that had brought him to this moment. He told himself that he was fighting against an unjust system, that he was taking from those who had taken from him. But the truth was simpler and more bitter. He'd become exactly what the world had expected him to become. A desperate man with nothing left to lose, clinging to life by his fingernails while the forces of civilization closed in around him. The irony wasn't lost on him that the very society he'd turned against was the same one that would eventually mythologize men like him. In years to come, dime novelists would write breathless tales of noble outlaws fighting for justice against corrupt officials and greedy railroad barons. They would transform desperate, half-starved criminals into romantic heroes, men of principle standing against the tide of progress and corruption. But Frank knew the truth. There was nothing noble about slowly starving in a cave. Nothing romantic about watching your companions die from infected wounds or contaminated water. There was no honor in terrorizing innocent travelers or shooting down men who were simply trying to do their jobs. The outlaw life was brutish, short, and filled with the kind of suffering that broke men's souls long before it broke their bodies. The sound of horses was getting closer now, and Frank could hear the voices of the men hunting him. Soon he would have to make a choice: surrender and face the hangman's noose, or make one last desperate stand against impossible odds. Either way, his story was nearing its end, just another cautionary tale in the unforgiving landscape of the American West. Frank Morrison had dreamed of redemption once, of somehow making his way back to respectability and a normal life. But those dreams had died somewhere along the trail, buried alongside the men he'd killed and the innocents he'd lost. Now there was only the wind, the approaching hoofbeats, and the cold metal of the gun in his hand as he prepared to write the final chapter of his brief, violent existence in the Wild West. Looking at your script summary and the reference materials, I'll continue part 4 from where you left off, focusing on Frank Morrison's story while exploring the brutal realities of bandit life in the Wild West. Frank Morrison crouched behind a weathered boulder, his breathing shallow as the sound of hoofbeats echoed through the canyon below. 3 months had passed since the failed bank robbery in Silverton, and the Pinkerton agents had been relentless in their pursuit. What had started as a desperate attempt to feed his family had transformed him into something he barely recognized: a hunted animal, constantly looking over his shoulder, trusting no one. The romantic notion of the outlaw hero, popularized by dime novels and campfire tales, bore no resemblance to Frank's current reality. His clothes were torn and filthy, his body gaunt from irregular meals of hardtack and whatever small game he could catch. The bullet wound in his shoulder, a souvenir from the Silverton job, had never properly healed. It throbbed constantly, a reminder of how quickly violence could turn against you in this unforgiving world. Frank's transformation into an outlaw hadn't been a choice born of adventure or rebellion. It had been pure necessity. The war had left him with nothing but scars, both visible and hidden. His small farm in Kansas had been burned during Quantrill's raids. His wife had died of consumption the following winter, and his young son had succumbed to fever shortly after. With no family, no land, and no prospects, Frank had drifted west like so many other broken men, carrying only his army colt and the clothes on his back. The decision to turn to banditry came gradually, born from a series of small compromises and mounting desperation. First, it was stealing food from unguarded camps, then taking a horse that wasn't his when his own mount went lame. Eventually, he found himself standing outside the miners' bank in Silverton with a bandana pulled over his face, his heart pounding so hard he was certain everyone could hear it. But the reality of outlaw life was nothing like the stories. There was no honor among thieves, no code of the West that protected the innocent. Frank had learned this lesson the hard way when his partner, a shifty-eyed drifter named Clem Hutchins, had tried to shoot him in the back for his share of their meager take from a stagecoach robbery. Frank had been faster, but the betrayal had shattered any illusions he might have harbored about the romantic nature of his new profession. The constant stress of being hunted was perhaps the worst part. Sleep came in fitful bursts, always with one ear listening for approaching riders. Frank had developed the habit of never sleeping in the same place twice, never staying in a town longer than necessary, never trusting anyone completely. The paranoia was exhausting, but it was also what kept him alive. Food was another constant concern. Unlike the well-supplied gangs of legend, most real outlaws lived on the edge of starvation. Frank often went days with nothing but water and whatever edible plants he could identify. When he did manage to secure food, through theft, purchase with stolen money, or the rare act of kindness from a sympathetic soul, he ate it quickly, never knowing when his next meal might come. The isolation was perhaps worse than the hunger. Frank had been a social man before the war, someone who enjoyed conversation and companionship. Now, human contact was a luxury he could rarely afford. Most people who might recognize him posed a threat, and those who didn't were usually best avoided anyway. The loneliness ate at him like a cancer, making him question not just his choices, but his sanity. Disease and injury were constant threats with no access to proper medical care. Frank had seen more than one outlaw die from infections that could have been easily treated in civilized society. A simple cut could become gangrenous, a broken bone could heal improperly, leaving a man crippled for life. Frank's own shoulder wound was a daily reminder of how precarious his health was. Sometimes, when the pain was particularly bad, he wondered if it wouldn't be better to simply walk into the nearest sheriff's office and surrender. The weather was another enemy. Unlike the heroes of dime novels, real outlaws couldn't simply retreat to comfortable hideouts when storms hit. Frank had endured blizzards huddled under insufficient blankets, had nearly died of heat exhaustion in the desert, and had spent countless nights shivering in caves or under rock overhangs, listening to rain drip steadily nearby. But perhaps the most corrosive aspect of outlaw life was the moral decay. Frank had been raised to believe in right and wrong, to respect other people's property, to solve problems through honest work rather than violence. Each crime he committed chipped away at the man he had once been. He justified his actions by telling himself he was only taking from those who could afford it, that he was simply trying to survive in a world that had abandoned him. But late at night, when sleep wouldn't come, he knew these were just excuses. The transformation was visible in more than just his appearance. Frank's speech had become coarser, his temper shorter. He found himself calculating the weaknesses of everyone he met, looking for advantages he could exploit. Trust, once given freely, became a foreign concept. Even acts of kindness were viewed with suspicion. What did the giver want in return? The psychological toll was evident in the way Frank's personality split between his public persona and his private thoughts. Around other outlaws, he projected an image of cold competence, a man who could handle himself in any situation. But alone, he was often overwhelmed by despair, by the weight of what his life had become. He sometimes talked to himself, carrying on conversations with his dead wife and son, seeking forgiveness for choices they would never have understood. Violence, once an abstract concept from his war days, had become a tool of survival. Frank had killed 3 men since turning outlaw, not counting those who might have died during the war, where death was anonymous and distant. Each killing haunted him differently. The first had been in self-defense, a drunk cowboy who had recognized him and tried to collect the bounty. The second had been during the stagecoach robbery, when a guard had gone for his gun despite Frank's warnings. The third had been Clem, his former partner in that moment of betrayal. Frank remembered each face, each moment when life left another man's eyes. The dime novels never mentioned how killing changed you, how it carved pieces out of your soul that could never be replaced. They certainly never described the practical aspects, the smell of blood and gunpowder, the way a body went heavy and awkward when life departed, the flies that came afterward. The bounty hunters were getting closer. Frank could feel it in the way conversation stopped when he entered saloons, in the nervous glances of shopkeepers, in the increasing frequency of wanted posters bearing his likeness. The drawing wasn't particularly accurate. It showed a clean-shaven man with neat hair and clear eyes, nothing like the bearded, hollow-eyed spectre he had become, but it was close enough that people were starting to notice. He had considered leaving the territory, heading to Mexico or California, where his reputation might not have preceded him. But travel required money, and money required jobs, and jobs for men like Frank Morrison inevitably meant more violence, more risk, more steps down the path he was already traveling. The irony wasn't lost on him that in trying to escape the poverty and powerlessness that had driven him to outlawry, he had only succeeded in making his situation worse. Now he was not just poor, but hunted, not just powerless, but completely outside the protection of law and society. The very acts that were supposed to provide him with resources and freedom had instead trapped him in a life of constant fear and degradation. As the hoofbeats below grew fainter, Frank allowed himself to relax slightly. Another close call, another day survived. But survival had become the only victory he could claim, and even that felt increasingly hollow. He thought of the farmers and merchants he had robbed, wondering if any of them had families depending on the money he had taken. The thought made his stomach clench with something beyond hunger. This was the reality of bandit life in the Wild West, not the glamorous adventure of legend, but a grinding existence of fear, violence, and moral compromise. Men like Frank Morrison weren't heroes or villains in any grand sense. They were simply broken people trying to survive in a world that offered them few alternatives. Their stories ended not in blazes of glory, but in unmarked graves, prison cells, or the slow dissolution of everything that had once made them human. The sun was setting, painting the canyon walls red like blood. Frank Morrison gathered his meager possessions and prepared to move again. Always moving, always running, always one step ahead of the reckoning that he knew, deep in his heart, was inevitable. In the distance, a coyote howled, a lonely sound that seemed to echo the emptiness in his own soul. Looking at the Wild West bandit narrative you've established, here's part 5 continuing Frank Morrison's brutal journey. The winter of 1884 found Frank Morrison huddled in a cave high in the Colorado Rockies, his body racked with fever and his mind teetering on the edge of madness. The romantic tales of outlaw glory had long since crumbled into dust, leaving only the harsh reality of a man slowly dying from the inside out. His once proud mustache now hung limp and greasy, framing a mouth missing 3 teeth, lost to scurvy and violence. The gang that had once numbered 12 strong souls had dwindled to just 4 desperate men, each eyeing the others with the calculating gaze of predators, wondering who would turn first. Frank's hands shook as he counted their remaining ammunition, 7 bullets between them all. 7 bullets to last until spring, to hunt game that grew scarcer each day, to defend against the Pinkerton agents who seemed to materialize from every shadow like vengeful spirits. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd spent more bullets in a single bank robbery back in '81 than he now possessed to keep himself alive through the bitter mountain winter. The cave stank of unwashed bodies, rancid meat, and the metallic tang of blood that never seemed to leave their clothes. Frank's partner Jake lay in the corner, delirious with infection from a bullet wound that had gone septic weeks ago. The smell of gangrene had become so familiar that Frank barely noticed it anymore, just another layer of misery in their festering hideout. They'd run out of whiskey to clean wounds 3 weeks back, leaving them to pour melted snow over torn flesh and pray to a god who seemed to have abandoned them entirely. Food had become an obsession that consumed their every waking moment. Frank's stomach had shrunk to the size of a child's fist, cramping constantly with hunger pangs that felt like knives twisting in his gut. They'd eaten their horses in November, choking down the tough, stringy meat while tears froze on their cheeks. By December, they were boiling leather belts and boots into a gelatinous soup that provided just enough nutrition to keep them breathing another day. Frank had lost so much weight that his gun belt hung loose around his waist like a child playing dress-up in his father's clothes. The psychological toll proved even more devastating than the physical hardships. Frank found himself talking to his dead brother, carrying on conversations with a phantom who offered advice on which mountain pass to take, or whether the approaching footsteps belonged to lawmen or fellow outlaws. Sleep brought no relief. Only nightmares where the faces of his victims rose from pools of blood to drag him down into darkness. He'd wake screaming, his voice echoing off the cave walls like the cry of a damned soul. The other gang members had begun to fracture under the pressure. Billy Craddock had developed a nervous twitch that made his left eye flutter constantly, and he'd taken to counting his breaths aloud in sets of 10 over and over until Frank wanted to strangle him just for the blessed silence. Tom Wheeler had stopped speaking entirely, communicating only in grunts and gestures, his eyes holding the 1,000-yard stare of a man who'd seen too much death and dealt too much pain. When the blizzard hit in January, sealing them in the cave for 6 days straight, Frank began to understand that this wasn't just hardship. This was judgment. The wind howled like the voices of every innocent person they'd terrorized, and the cold seeped into their bones with such vicious intensity that Frank wondered if hell might actually be a place of ice rather than fire. They burned everything they could find, wanted posters with their own faces, playing cards worn smooth by desperate hands, even pages torn from Jake's Bible, in moments of such desperation that blasphemy seemed like a luxury they could finally afford. The Pinkertons had been relentless in their pursuit, displaying a professional patience that unnerved Frank more than any cavalry charge ever could. These weren't the bumbling local sheriffs they'd outrun in their early days. These were men who studied their prey like scientists, learning their habits, their weaknesses, their fears. Frank had found their calling cards left at previous hideouts, a single bullet placed deliberately on a rock, or their names carved into a tree trunk with surgical precision. The message was clear. We know where you've been, and we know where you're going. Detective Samuel Harrison had become Frank's personal nemesis, a ghost who seemed to anticipate every move. Harrison had lost a partner to Frank's gang during a shootout in Kansas, and the pursuit had become personal. Frank had seen the man's photograph in a newspaper, noting the cold intelligence in his eyes and the set of his jaw that spoke of absolute determination. This wasn't a man who would give up or be bought off or scared away. This was judgment incarnate, patient and inexorable as death itself. The realization that death was stalking them had changed the dynamic within the gang completely. Trust, already fragile, evaporated like morning mist. Frank caught Billy going through his saddlebags one night, looking for hidden money or ammunition. Tom had started sleeping with his gun drawn, and Frank noticed that the man's eyes followed him constantly, calculating distances and angles like a predator sizing up potential prey. The bonds that had once held them together, shared danger, mutual dependence, the camaraderie of outlaws against the world, had corroded into suspicion and barely contained violence. Frank's own moral compass had long since shattered beyond repair. The man who'd once felt guilty about stealing bread from a general store now found himself capable of acts that would have horrified his younger self. When they'd stumbled across a lone traveller in November, Frank hadn't hesitated to put a bullet in the man's head for his coat and boots. The stranger's crime had been nothing more than being alone and vulnerable in their path. Frank had rifled through the corpse's pockets with hands steady as stone, feeling nothing but mild disappointment at finding only $3 and a handful of peppermint candy. The transformation felt complete when Frank caught himself eyeing Jake's infected body and calculating how long the meat might last if properly preserved in the snow. The thought had come unbidden, practical and horrible, and Frank realized that whatever he'd once been, farmer, family man, even simple criminal, had been burned away by the brutal necessities of survival. He was becoming something feral, something that belonged more to the animal kingdom than to human society. Spring seemed like a cruel myth as February ground on with no sign of warming. Frank's beard had grown wild and matted, home to lice and bits of frozen food that he'd forgotten to clean away. His clothes had taken on the consistency of armor, stiff with dried blood, sweat, and filth that had accumulated over months of desperate living. The smell that rose from his body was so rank that even he noticed it, a mixture of rot and fear and unwashed humanity that marked him as clearly as any brand. The isolation had begun to break down the barriers between thought and speech, and Frank found himself narrating his actions aloud, providing commentary on his own degradation, like a doctor observing symptoms in a patient. "Frank Morrison checks his ammunition for the 100th time today," he'd mutter, finding the same 7 bullets he counted an hour ago. The sound of his own voice had become both comfort and torment, a reminder that he still existed even as everything human about him continued to waste away. When Jake finally died on a bitter February night, Frank felt only relief that the man's delirious rambling had finally stopped. They'd grown tired of listening to him call for his mother, tired of his fever dreams about childhood summers and Sunday dinners, and all the innocent pleasures that seemed to belong to another species entirely. Frank and the remaining gang members had stared at the corpse with the detached interest of scavengers, already planning how to dispose of the body when the ground thawed enough to dig. The psychological pressure of being hunted had created a paranoia so intense that Frank jumped at shadows and heard pursuit in every wind-blown branch. Sleep came in fragments, never more than an hour at a time, leaving him in a constant state of exhausted alertness that made his hands shake and his vision blur. He'd lost the ability to distinguish between real threats and phantom dangers, drawing his gun on rabbits and spending precious ammunition on shadows that might have been men. As winter began its slow retreat and the first hints of spring appeared in the lengthening days, Frank Morrison understood with crystal clarity that he would never see another winter. The Pinkertons were closing in with the methodical precision of a noose being tightened, and his own body was failing him more each day. The romantic outlaw who'd ridden out of Kansas 3 years earlier was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed scarecrow whose very presence seemed to drain the warmth from the air around him. The brutal truth of the outlaw life had stripped away every illusion, every lie he'd told himself about freedom and adventure, and taking what he wanted from a world that had taken everything from him. All that remained was the grinding arithmetic of survival. Bullets versus enemies, food versus hunger, warmth versus the killing cold that lived in his bones now and would never fully leave. Frank Morrison had become exactly what the frontier made of men who chose violence as their solution to life's problems. A walking ghost, already dead, but too stubborn or too afraid to lie down and admit it. Here's part 6 of the script, continuing from where we left off. The stench of human waste and rotting flesh permeated every corner of Frank's world. After 3 years of running, hiding, and stealing, his body had become a walking testament to the brutal toll of outlaw life. His teeth, what remained of them, were black stumps riddled with decay. The constant diet of hardtack, stolen scraps, and whatever rodents they could catch had left him malnourished and weak. His gums bled when he ate, and the sharp pain of infected teeth kept him awake most nights. But the physical decay was nothing compared to what was happening to his mind. Frank Morrison had become someone he no longer recognized. The farm boy who once helped his neighbors harvest their crops was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed predator who would kill a man for a few silver coins. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had been a slow erosion, like water wearing away stone, each violent act chipping away another piece of his humanity until nothing remained but survival instinct and rage. The gang's latest hideout was a rat-infested cave system in the Badlands of New Mexico territory. They'd been holed up here for 2 months after a disastrous bank robbery in Tucson that had left 2 of their number dead and the rest wounded. Frank pressed his back against the cold stone wall and tried to ignore the scurrying sounds of rats fighting over scraps of moldy bread. Water dripped constantly from the ceiling, creating muddy pools that bred mosquitoes and disease. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, human waste, and the sickly sweet odor of infected wounds. 3 of the remaining gang members were suffering from dysentery, their bodies racked with fever and bloody diarrhea. Frank had watched grown men reduced to whimpering children, begging for death to take them. The isolation was driving them all mad. They couldn't risk going into town for supplies, couldn't light fires that might give away their position, couldn't even venture far from the cave during daylight hours. They lived like animals, sleeping in their own filth, suspicious of every shadow and sound. Frank's hands shook as he cleaned his Colt revolver for the third time that day. The repetitive motion was the only thing that kept his mind from completely unraveling. He'd developed a nervous tic, constantly checking over his shoulder, jumping at the slightest noise. The other men had noticed. He could see it in their eyes, the way they watched him when they thought he wasn't looking. Trust was a luxury they could no longer afford. Jake Coleman, the gang's unofficial leader since their previous chief had taken a bullet to the head in Tucson, was showing signs of the same mental deterioration. He'd started talking to himself, muttering about imaginary pursuers and phantom sounds. Last week, Frank had found him standing at the cave entrance at 3 a.m, his rifle aimed at nothing, convinced he'd seen a Pinkerton agent in the moonlight. "They're coming for us," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible over the constant dripping. "I can feel them getting closer." Frank said nothing. They were all feeling it now, the invisible noose tightening around their necks. The Pinkerton Detective Agency had put substantial bounties on their heads, and every lawman, bounty hunter, and desperate citizen in 3 territories was looking for them. There was nowhere left to run. The irony wasn't lost on Frank. They turned to banditry for freedom, for the chance to escape the grinding poverty and hopelessness of legitimate life. Instead, they'd traded one prison for another, exchanging the chains of honest labor for the shackles of constant fear and paranoia. Food was running dangerously low. Their last supplies had been contaminated by rats, leaving them with barely enough hardtack and beans to last another week. Frank's stomach cramped constantly from hunger, a gnawing pain that had become as familiar as breathing. He'd lost so much weight that his clothes hung on his frame like burial shrouds. The other men were no better. Tommy Briggs, barely 19 years old, had aged a decade in the past year. His face was gaunt and hollow, his eyes sunken deep in their sockets. He'd developed a persistent cough that brought up blood, a sure sign that consumption was taking hold. In the civilized world, he might have received treatment, might have had a chance. Here in this godforsaken cave, he was simply waiting to die. Water was another constant concern. The small stream that trickled through the back of the cave was their only source, and it was contaminated with bat droppings and God knows what else. They'd all suffered bouts of illness from drinking it, but the alternative was death by dehydration. Frank had learned to strain it through his shirt and let it settle before drinking, but he could still taste the foulness with every sip. Personal hygiene had become impossible. They stank like corpses, their clothes stiff with sweat, blood, and grime. Frank's hair was matted and crawling with lice. His skin was covered in sores and rashes from the constant filth and poor nutrition. Open wounds festered without proper care, attracting flies and breeding infection. The psychological toll was perhaps the cruelest aspect of their existence. Frank found himself thinking more and more about his childhood, about the simple pleasures he'd taken for granted. A hot meal prepared by his mother, clean sheets, and a real bed. The sound of church bells on Sunday morning. These memories felt like torture now, reminders of a world he could never return to. Sleep brought no relief. When exhaustion finally claimed him, Frank's dreams were filled with the faces of his victims. The bank teller in Colorado, who'd begged for his life before Frank put a bullet in his chest. The stagecoach passenger who'd tried to protect his wife and daughter. The sheriff's deputy who'd been barely older than Tommy when Frank shot him down in the street. He'd lost count of how many men he'd killed. The number had stopped mattering somewhere around the 10th, when the weight of each death had become too much to bear individually. Now, they blurred together into a single, crushing mass of guilt and horror that threatened to drive him completely insane. The gang had rules about not talking about the killings, about keeping focused on survival rather than dwelling on the past. But in the long, dark hours of the night, with nothing but the sound of dripping water and labored breathing, the memories came anyway. They always came. Frank wondered sometimes if this was hell, if he'd died somewhere along the way and been condemned to this eternal existence of fear, hunger, and regret. The thought brought him no comfort. If this was his punishment, it was fitting. He'd earned every moment of suffering through his choices, his violence, his complete abandonment of everything he'd once believed was right. The worst part was knowing there was no way back. Even if he somehow survived, even if he managed to escape the law and start over somewhere else, he would always be a killer. The blood on his hands would never wash clean. The faces of his victims would follow him to the grave and beyond. As dawn broke over the desert, casting weak light through the cave entrance, Frank Morrison closed his eyes and tried to remember what it felt like to be human. But that man was gone, buried beneath years of violence and brutality, leaving only this hollow shell of paranoia and despair. The brutal life of a bandit in the Wild West wasn't the romantic adventure of dime novels and campfire stories. It was a slow descent into madness, a gradual stripping away of everything that made life worth living. And for Frank Morrison, there would be no redemption, no last-minute salvation, only the inevitable reckoning that awaited all who chose the outlaw's path. Part 7. The Wages of Sin. Frank Morrison's hand trembled as he tried to steady his revolver against the telegraph pole. 3 weeks had passed since their botched train robbery outside Tombstone, and the bullet wound in his shoulder had turned a sickly green around the edges. The smell of rotting flesh followed him everywhere now, a constant reminder that death was stalking him with the patience of a seasoned hunter. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd joined Dutch McKinnon's gang 3 years ago, believing the romantic tales of outlaws living free on the frontier. No bosses, no schedules, no grovelling for scraps from rich men's tables. Just him, his horse, and the endless horizon. But as he crouched behind a water barrel in the pre-dawn darkness of Deadwood, waiting for the bank to open, Frank realized he'd simply traded one form of slavery for another. The gang had been reduced to 4 men. Tommy Briggs had taken a shotgun blast to the chest during their escape from Tombstone and bled out somewhere in the Arizona desert. They'd left his body for the buzzards, rather than risk a proper burial that might draw attention. Dutch had ordered them to move fast, always move fast, because the Pinkertons were closing in. Those detective agents were nothing like the bumbling local sheriffs Frank had expected to outwit. They were professional manhunters with modern communication methods, detailed files on every known outlaw, and the financial backing of railroad companies who wanted their property protected. Alan Pinkerton's men tracked criminals across state lines with the methodical precision of military campaigns. They used telegraph networks to coordinate their movements, employed local informants, and never seemed to sleep. Frank's stomach cramped with hunger as he watched the bank manager fumble with his keys across the street. They'd been living on hardtack and whatever small game they could catch for weeks now. The romantic notion of rustling cattle had died hard when they discovered that moving stolen livestock required connections, safe houses, and more planning than their desperate circumstances allowed. Instead, they'd been reduced to robbing isolated homesteads and small-town general stores for coffee and ammunition. The psychological toll was becoming unbearable. Sleep brought nightmares of hanging ropes and firing squads. Frank had watched his reflection in creek water change from a young man seeking adventure to a hollow-eyed spectre who jumped at every unexpected sound. The constant fear had worn grooves in his mind like water-carving stone. He'd developed a nervous tic where he constantly checked over his shoulder, and his hands shook even when he wasn't afraid. Dutch McKinnon had changed too. The charismatic leader who once spun tales of a criminal empire stretching from Mexico to Canada now spoke in paranoid whispers about traitors and plots. He'd begun executing elaborate rituals before each job, consulting a worn deck of playing cards as if they contained divine guidance. 2 nights ago, he'd pistol-whipped Ned Garrett for questioning whether they should surrender and seek clemency. The beating had been savage and unnecessary, driven by Dutch's growing inability to distinguish between leadership and madness. The worst part was how violence had become routine. Frank could remember feeling sick after his first robbery when Dutch had coldly shot an unarmed bank clerk who'd been slow to open the safe. Now, 3 years later, Frank barely flinched when necessary killing presented itself. The moral boundaries that had once defined his character had eroded like riverbanks in a flood. He told himself it was survival, but late at night, he wondered if he was simply becoming the monster the newspapers claimed he already was. Their hideout in an abandoned mining camp reflected their deteriorating circumstances. The wooden structures were rotting from neglect, with gaps in the walls that let in rain and snow. They'd stuffed rags and newspapers into the holes, but the cold still crept through every night. The well had been contaminated by runoff from the old mine workings, forcing them to melt snow or ride miles to find clean water. Their horses were developing sores from poor feed and inadequate shelter. Medical care was impossible. When outlaws got sick or injured, they either recovered on their own or died. Frank's infected shoulder wound had started as a minor graze, but without proper cleaning or antibiotics that wouldn't be invented for another 50 years, it had become a festering mess that attracted flies during the day. He'd tried burning it closed with a heated knife blade, but that had only made the infection worse. Now green pus leaked through his shirt, and he could feel the poison spreading through his bloodstream. The isolation was maddening. They couldn't visit towns, except for quick raids, couldn't write letters to family, couldn't form relationships with anyone who might betray them for reward money. Frank hadn't spoken to his sister in Missouri for over 2 years. He didn't even know if his mother was still alive. The outlaw life promised freedom, but delivered a prison of loneliness and paranoia. Money was always scarce despite their criminal activities. Most frontier banks kept limited cash on hand, and the small-town robberies that were their specialty netted $20 or $30 at best. After buying ammunition, food, and supplies, there was rarely enough left to justify the enormous risks they were taking. Frank had calculated that their average monthly income was less than what a factory worker in Chicago earned legally. The difference was that factory workers went home to families and slept peacefully at night. The mythology surrounding outlaws was largely created by dime novelists and newspaper editors who'd never spent a day in the saddle with real criminals. The reality was that most bandits were desperate men driven to crime by economic hardship, personal tragedy, or simple lack of alternatives. Frank had joined Dutch's gang after losing his farm to a combination of drought and predatory lending practices. He'd been facing starvation when Dutch offered him a horse and a share of whatever they could steal. Now, watching the bank manager finally get his door open, Frank realized that their latest scheme was probably suicidal. Deadwood was a boomtown full of armed miners and professional gamblers. The local sheriff had a reputation for shooting first and asking questions later, but they were too desperate for alternatives. Frank's infection was getting worse daily. Ned Garrett had developed a persistent cough that sounded like consumption, and Dutch was showing signs of complete mental breakdown. The plan was simple, because complex strategies required resources they didn't possess. They would enter the bank just after opening, when the manager would be alone counting yesterday's deposits. Dutch would control the front door while Frank and Ned emptied the safe. They'd escape on fresh horses they'd stolen the night before and disappear into the Black Hills before word could spread. But Frank knew that their luck had run out weeks ago. The Pinkertons were closing their net with each passing day. Wanted posters bearing their likenesses had appeared in every settlement from Nebraska to Wyoming. The reward money had grown large enough to tempt even close associates. Every stranger they encountered might be an informant. Every town they approached might be a trap. As Dutch gave the signal to move, Frank felt the weight of his choices settling on him like a funeral shroud. This wasn't the life he'd imagined when he'd first strapped on a gun belt and ridden away from his failed farm. The romance of the outlaw trail was a cruel fiction that had lured him into a nightmare of violence, disease, and moral degradation. He was no longer Frank Morrison, failed farmer seeking a better life. He had become a walking corpse, already dead in every way that mattered, just waiting for his body to catch up with reality. The bank robbery would be their last. Frank could feel it in his bones with the same certainty that told him his infected wound would kill him within days if a lawman's bullet didn't find him first. As he stumbled across the muddy street toward what he knew would be his final crime, Frank Morrison understood that the brutal life of a bandit in the Wild West was not a path to freedom, but a long, slow suicide performed in front of an audience that cheered for the rope. Looking at your previous work, I can see you've developed a compelling narrative style that balances historical brutality with engaging storytelling. Here's part 8 of your script, continuing the story of Frank Morrison and the brutal realities of outlaw life. As Frank Morrison crouched in the shadows of yet another abandoned mine shaft, his weathered hands trembling as he counted the meager coins from their latest robbery, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The Pinkerton agents had been closing in for weeks now, their methodical pursuit relentless as a winter storm. What Frank didn't know was that Alan Pinkerton himself had personally assigned his best tracker, a cold-eyed Scotsman named Mackenzie, to bring him in, dead or alive. The reality of being hunted by the Pinkertons was far worse than any outlaw could imagine. These weren't the bumbling local sheriffs that populated dime novels. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency was America's first professional law enforcement organization, employing former soldiers, railroad detectives, and men who understood violence as intimately as any outlaw. They had resources that frontier bandits could barely comprehend. Telegraph networks allowed them to coordinate across vast distances, sharing information about gang movements faster than any horse could carry it. They maintained detailed files on known criminals, complete with photographs, known associates, and behavioral patterns. Mackenzie had been tracking Frank's gang for 3 months, studying their methods like a scientist examining specimens. He knew that Frank favored abandoned mining camps for hideouts, that he always posted lookouts on the eastern approaches, and that he had a habit of leaving towns just before dawn. The Pinkerton detective had interviewed shopkeepers, saloon girls, and stable boys in a dozen towns, slowly building a profile of his quarry. Frank thought he was clever, but every man leaves a trail, and Mackenzie was exceptionally good at reading sign. The psychological warfare employed by the Pinkertons was perhaps their most effective weapon. They would arrive in a town ahead of their targets, spreading word that they were coming, posting reward notices with increasingly large bounties. The knowledge that professional manhunters were closing in created a paranoia that ate at outlaws from within. Sleep became impossible. Every stranger on the street could be an agent. Every friendly conversation might be an interrogation. The constant stress aged men years in months, turning their hair grey and carving deep lines into their faces. Frank's gang was already showing the strain. Big Jim had developed a nervous twitch that made his gun hand shake uncontrollably. Red Pete jumped at every unexpected sound, once drawing his weapon on a church bell. The youngest member of the gang, a 19-year-old kid they called Buttons, had started talking to himself, carrying on entire conversations with people who weren't there. The isolation and pressure of outlaw life had fractured his mind. leaving him more liability than asset. The physical toll of constant flight was equally devastating. Frank's gang had been living on hardtack and creek water for weeks, their bodies slowly consuming themselves for energy. Scurvy had left their gums bleeding and their teeth loose. Dysentery racked their bowels, leaving them weak and dehydrated. Red Pete had developed a persistent cough that brought up flecks of blood, likely tuberculosis contracted from sleeping in damp caves and abandoned buildings. In the civilized world, these ailments could be treated. On the run, they were death sentences delivered in slow installments. The winter of 1873 was particularly brutal, and Frank's gang found themselves trapped in a mountain cabin as snow piled against the windows. For 3 weeks, they survived on a single bag of beans and whatever small game buttons could trap. The cold was so intense that ice formed on the inside walls of the cabin. They burned furniture, then floorboards, then anything that would catch fire. Big Jim lost 2 toes to frostbite before the weather broke enough for them to move on. But the Pinkertons weren't the only threat closing in on Frank Morrison. The outlaw's own past was catching up with him in ways he never anticipated. Word had reached the authorities that Frank had family back in Missouri, a sister named Mary who ran a boarding house in Kansas City. What Frank didn't know was that the Pinkertons had been watching Mary's establishment for months, waiting patiently for her brother to make contact. The agency's tactics often involved using family members as unwitting bait. They would station agents in towns where outlaws had relatives, monitoring mail and watching for any sign of communication. Sometimes they would even spread false information about family emergencies, hoping to draw their targets into the open. The emotional manipulation was as ruthless as any physical pursuit, exploiting the very human connections that made life bearable. Frank's sister Mary had no idea that her weekly letters to a post office box in Denver were being intercepted and read by federal agents. Her innocent updates about neighborhood gossip and family news provided the Pinkertons with valuable intelligence about Frank's movements and state of mind. When she mentioned that their mother was ill and asking for Frank, the agents knew they had found their leverage. The psychological profile that Mackenzie had developed suggested that Frank Morrison, despite his criminal activities, retained strong family loyalty. The detective wagered that news of his mother's illness would eventually draw the outlaw back to Missouri, regardless of the risk. It was a patient game, but the Pinkertons were nothing if not patient. Meanwhile, Frank's gang was falling apart from within. The stress of constant pursuit had created fractures that widened with each passing day. Big Jim blamed Red Pete for their current predicament, claiming that Pete's distinctive red hair made them too easily identifiable. Red Pete, in turn, accused Buttons of being a jinx, pointing to the string of failed robberies since the young man had joined the gang. The paranoia was infectious, spreading through the group like a disease. Trust, the most precious commodity in outlaw society, had become a luxury they could no longer afford. Each man slept with his gun within reach, not just for protection from outside threats, but from his own companions. The bonds that had once held them together as a gang were dissolving under the relentless pressure of their hunted existence. The reality was that most outlaw gangs didn't survive their first year intact. Death, capture, or betrayal claimed the majority within months of their formation. Those that lasted longer often did so only because they were lucky enough to avoid the attention of professional lawmen. Once the Pinkertons or federal marshals took an interest, the odds shifted dramatically against the criminals. Frank Morrison's story was playing out exactly as Alan Pinkerton had predicted when he first established his agency. The romantic notion of the noble outlaw would crumble under the weight of professional law enforcement, systematic investigation, and the simple reality that crime, ultimately, didn't pay. The West was being tamed not by gunfighters and vigilantes, but by men with badges, telegraphs, and the patience to see justice done properly. As Frank huddled in that mine shaft, counting his pathetic handful of coins, He was already a dead man walking. He just didn't know it yet. The net was closing, and there would be no dramatic last stand, no blaze of glory. Just the cold, methodical efficiency of professional manhunters doing their job. The brutal life of a bandit in the Wild West was coming to an end, not with the crack of gunfire, but with the quiet click of handcuffs and the scratch of a pen signing a death warrant. The dim light of another sleepless night cast long shadows across Frank Morrison's face as he hunched over a flickering campfire, his weathered hands trembling as he cleaned his revolver. The weight of his choices pressed down on him like the heavy silence of the Wyoming wilderness that surrounded his makeshift camp. What had started as a desperate act of survival after losing his farm had transformed him into something he barely recognized. A man whose name was whispered in saloons and whose face adorned wanted posters from Denver to Dodge City. The romantic tales of noble outlaws riding into sunsets were nothing more than cruel fiction. Frank's reality was a relentless nightmare of constant fear, gnawing hunger, and the suffocating knowledge that every dawn might be his last. His gang, once bound by desperation and dreams of easy money, had slowly disintegrated under the crushing pressure of their hunted existence. Tommy Red Sullivan had been gunned down outside a bank in Tombstone, his blood painting the dusty street crimson. Jake Martinez had simply vanished one night, leaving behind only his horse and a note that read, "I can't do this anymore." The others who remained were shells of their former selves, paranoid, trigger-happy men who slept with one eye open and trusted no one completely. They moved from hideout to hideout like wounded animals, never staying in one place long enough to call it home. The caves and abandoned shacks they sheltered in reeked of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and the acrid smell of fear sweat that no amount of creek water could wash away. Frank's body bore the accumulated toll of months on the run. A bullet wound in his shoulder from their botched robbery in Abilene had never properly healed, leaving him with a persistent ache that flared up in cold weather. His teeth, once straight and white, were now yellowed and loose from malnutrition, and the constant stress that ground his jaw tight, even in sleep. Dark circles ringed his sunken eyes, and his once powerful frame had withered to sinew and bone. But it wasn't just his physical deterioration that haunted Frank in the small hours before dawn. It was the slow erosion of his humanity, the way violence had become as natural as breathing. He could still remember the shock he'd felt during their first robbery when he'd struck an elderly bank clerk with the butt of his gun. Now, such acts barely registered in his consciousness. The line between survival and savagery had blurred beyond recognition. The Pinkerton Detective Agency had been tracking them for months, their methods as relentless as they were sophisticated. Unlike the bumbling local sheriffs Frank had initially outmaneuvered, the Pinkertons operated with military precision. They used telegraph networks to coordinate their efforts across state lines, employed informants in every major town, and had developed psychological profiles of each gang member that were disturbingly accurate. Agent Harrison Blackwood, the lead investigator on Frank's case, had spent weeks studying every robbery, every witness account, every scrap of evidence. He understood that Frank's desperation would eventually drive him to make a mistake, and Blackwood was prepared to exploit that weakness. The detective had already turned two of Frank's former associates, offering them reduced sentences in exchange for information about the gang's hideouts and planned targets. The psychological warfare was perhaps the most devastating aspect of the Pinkerton strategy. They would leave wanted posters in places where Frank was sure to see them, each one increasing the bounty on his head. They spread rumors through saloons about which gang members were secretly cooperating with authorities, sowing seeds of distrust that grew into paranoid accusations and violent confrontations within the group. Frank's remaining companions, Dirty, Pete Kowalski, and young Billy Hawthorne, were cracking under the pressure. Pete had developed a nervous twitch and jumped at every unexpected sound, while Billy, barely 19, had started talking to himself and laughing at inappropriate times. The kid reminded Frank too much of his younger brother back home, the one who died of consumption while Frank was off playing soldier in the war. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest punishment of all. Frank couldn't write to his sister Mary, couldn't send money to help with his mother's medical bills, couldn't even visit his father's grave. He was a ghost haunting the edges of civilization, watching life continue without him, while he slowly faded from the memory of everyone who had once loved him. Food was a constant struggle. They couldn't risk staying in towns long enough to buy proper supplies, so they survived on whatever they could hunt, steal, or forage. Frank's stomach had shrunk from months of irregular meals, and the persistent hunger had become a dull ache he barely noticed anymore. When they did manage to acquire food, it was often spoiled or contaminated, leading to bouts of dysentery that left them weak and vulnerable. The romantic notion of outlaws as free men living by their own rules was laughable to Frank now. He was more enslaved than he'd ever been as a farmer, bound by the iron chains of fear and desperation. Every decision was dictated by survival, every action calculated to avoid capture. There was no freedom in constantly looking over your shoulder, no liberty in being unable to trust anyone completely. Sleep, when it came at all, was fitful and plagued by nightmares. Frank would dream of his father's disappointed face, of the bank clerk he'd beaten, of the posse that would eventually corner him in some dusty canyon with no way out. He'd wake gasping and reaching for his gun, only to realize he was still alive for another day in this waking nightmare. The weather offered no mercy to men living rough. Summer brought scorching heat that turned their hideouts into furnaces, while winter brought bone-chilling cold that no amount of stolen blankets could ward off. Rain turned their shelters into muddy quagmires, and snow made tracking too easy for their pursuers. Frank's joints ached constantly from sleeping on hard ground, and his clothes hung in tatters that he mended with whatever scraps he could find. Disease was another constant threat in their unsanitary conditions. Without access to proper medical care, even minor injuries could become life-threatening infections. Frank had watched good men die from simple cuts that turned septic, their bodies burning with fever as they writhed in agony. The smell of gangrene and death had become as familiar as the scent of gunpowder and fear. The psychological toll of taking human life weighed heavily on Frank's conscience. Each robbery brought fresh blood on his hands. Each shootout added new faces to the gallery of the dead that haunted his dreams. He tried to tell himself it was kill or be killed, that he was just trying to survive in a world that had shown him no mercy. But in his quiet moments, he knew he had become the very thing he once would have despised. The gang's cohesion continued to deteriorate as paranoia and desperation ate away at their bonds. Arguments over the division of their meager spoils turned violent, and Frank found himself sleeping with his gun drawn even around his own men. Trust, once the only currency that mattered in their world, had become a luxury none of them could afford. News from the outside world reached them in fragments. Whispered conversations overheard in saloons. Newspapers stolen from stagecoaches. Rumors passed along by the few remaining contacts, who hadn't yet abandoned them. Frank learned that his sister had married a shopkeeper in Kansas City, that his mother's health was failing, that the farm he'd fought so hard to save had been sold to pay his debts. The life he'd tried to preserve through crime had crumbled anyway, making his sacrifice meaningless. The irony wasn't lost on Frank that in trying to save his family's legacy, he had destroyed any chance of being part of it. His name would be remembered, but not as a loving son or protective brother. History would record him as Frank Morrison the outlaw, the desperate man who chose violence over virtue and paid the ultimate price for his decision. As dawn approached and the fire burned low, Frank could feel the net tightening around him. The Pinkertons were close. He could sense it in the way conversation stopped when strangers entered saloons, in the nervous glances of people who might have recognized him, in the increasing frequency of wanted posters bearing his likeness. His time was running out, and they all knew it. The myth of the noble outlaw would live on in dime novels and campfire stories, but Frank Morrison understood the brutal truth. There was no glory in this life, no honor in this death that awaited him. He was just another broken man who had lost his way in a world that offered few choices to those born without privilege or power. And as the eastern sky began to lighten with the promise of another day of running, hiding, and slowly dying inside, Frank Morrison prepared to face whatever end awaited him in the unforgiving wilderness of the American West. Looking at your summary and the reference materials, I'll continue with part 10 of Boring History. The brutal life of a bandit in the Wild West, focusing on the psychological and social deterioration of outlaw life while maintaining the established tone and pacing. The winter of 1885 found Frank Morrison and his remaining gang members holed up in a ramshackle cabin deep in the Colorado Rockies, their once proud brotherhood reduced to 3 suspicious, hollow-eyed men who barely trusted each other enough to sleep in the same room. The romantic notion of outlaws as noble rebels had long since crumbled under the weight of reality, replaced by the grim understanding that they were little more than desperate animals clawing for survival in an increasingly hostile world. Frank stared into the dying embers of their meager fire, his weathered face a map of every poor decision that had led him to this moment. At 34, he looked 50, his hair prematurely grey, his hands permanently stained with gunpowder and blood. The man who had once dreamed of easy money and frontier freedom now understood the brutal mathematics of outlaw life. For every dollar stolen, they paid 10 in suffering, paranoia, and slow spiritual death. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had been a gradual erosion, like water wearing away stone, each failed robbery and narrow escape chipping away another piece of their humanity until nothing remained but the hollow shell of what they once were. The gang that had started with 8 men full of misguided hope and desperate bravado now consisted of Frank, the tubercular Jimmy Caldwell, whose constant coughing had become their death rattle soundtrack, and Ezra Thornton, a man so consumed by suspicion that he slept with one hand on his gun and the other clutching his share of their dwindling money. The psychological toll of constant flight had warped their minds in ways that no amount of stolen gold could repair. Sleep came in fitful bursts, haunted by nightmares of pursuing lawmen and the faces of their victims. They started at every sound, their nerves frayed to the breaking point by months of looking over their shoulders. Frank found himself talking to ghosts, carrying on conversations with dead gang members in the dark hours before dawn, his grip on reality loosening like sand through his fingers. Trust, the foundation of any successful criminal enterprise, had become their scarcest commodity. They ate in shifts, never allowing more than one man to handle the cooking. Money was counted and recounted obsessively, each member convinced the others were skimming from the pot. Simple conversations became exercises in paranoia, every word passed for hidden meaning, every gesture analyzed for signs of betrayal. The brotherhood that had once sustained them through adversity had curdled into mutual hatred, held in check only by their shared dependence. The Pinkerton Detective Agency had become their nemesis in ways that went far beyond simple law enforcement. Alan Pinkerton's men operated with a sophistication that made traditional outlawry obsolete, using modern communication, detailed record-keeping, and coordinated operations that spanned multiple states. They had photographs of Frank and his men circulated to every sheriff's office, railway station, and bank from Kansas to California. The Pinkertons didn't just chase criminals. They studied them, predicted their movements, and systematically dismantled their support networks with scientific precision. Frank had watched the agency's methods destroy other gangs with terrifying efficiency. They would infiltrate criminal organizations, turn gang members against each other with promises of reduced sentences, and coordinate simultaneous raids that left outlaws with nowhere to run. The Pinkertons had even planted false information in newspapers, spreading rumors designed to sow discord among criminal groups and drive them into the open, where they could be captured. The psychological warfare was perhaps even more effective than their investigative techniques. Knowing that Pinkerton agents could be anywhere, disguised as anyone, had made Frank's gang afraid of their own shadows. They avoided saloons where they might encounter undercover operatives, steered clear of brothels where working girls might be reporting to the agency, and even grew suspicious of seemingly innocent travelers they encountered on remote trails. The Pinkertons had weaponized paranoia itself, turning it against the criminals they pursued. But it wasn't just external pressure that was destroying them. The internal corruption of outlaw life was eating them alive from within. Violence, once a tool to be used sparingly, had become their first response to every problem. Frank watched Jimmy pistol whip a store clerk during their last robbery simply because the man had been too slow reaching for the cash drawer. The casual brutality that had once shocked them now seemed as natural as breathing, a moral callousness that spread through their souls like gangrene. They had become experts in the gradations of human suffering, connoisseurs of fear who could read terror in a victim's eyes and calibrate their threats accordingly. Frank remembered the early days when they would apologize to their robbery victims, almost embarrassed by their criminality. Now they took a perverse pleasure in others' pain, their empathy having withered away through constant exposure to violence and desperation. The women in their lives had either fled or been driven away by their increasing instability. Frank's common-law wife, Sarah, had left him after he'd struck her during a drunken rage, taking their infant daughter to parts unknown. He sometimes caught himself searching crowds for glimpses of the child he would never know, the family destroyed by his choices haunting him more than any posse ever could. The isolation was complete. They were outcasts, even among outcasts, too dangerous for polite society and too broken for criminal brotherhood. Their criminal activities had devolved from ambitious train robberies to desperate small-time theft. They held up general stores for pocket change, rustled cattle for quick sales to unscrupulous buyers, and occasionally robbed travelers, foolish enough to venture into their territory alone. Each crime brought diminishing returns, while carrying the same risk of capture or death, the mathematics of their profession having turned decisively against them. The physical degradation mirrored their moral decay. Malnutrition had left them gaunt and weak, their once powerful frames reduced to scarecrow thinness. Dental problems plagued them all, their teeth rotting from poor diet and lack of care, giving their speech a whistling quality that made them self-conscious and more isolated. Skin diseases, parasites, and infected wounds were constant companions, their bodies breaking down under the stress of their harsh lifestyle. Frank's hands shook constantly now, whether from alcohol withdrawal, malnutrition, or simple nervous exhaustion, he couldn't say. The steady aim that had once made him feared across 3 territories was gone, replaced by trembling uncertainty that made every gunfight a gamble with death. He had become a liability to his own gang, a broken-down old outlaw whose reputation was built on abilities he no longer possessed. The winter cold seemed to seep into their bones and stay there, a bone-deep chill that no fire could warm. They huddled together for warmth while simultaneously watching each other for signs of treachery, their survival instincts warring with their need for human contact. Conversations consisted mainly of arguments about their next move, each man convinced the others were leading them toward capture or death. Jimmy's tuberculosis had worsened dramatically, his coughing fits now producing alarming amounts of blood that he tried to hide from the others. They all knew he was dying, but nobody spoke of it directly, the spectre of death having become too familiar to acknowledge. His decline served as a preview of their own inevitable fate, a reminder that outlaw life was ultimately a death sentence carried out by degrees. Ezra had developed an obsession with cleaning his weapons, spending hours every day meticulously maintaining his guns and knives with ritualistic precision. The activity seemed to be the only thing that calmed his nerves, the familiar routine providing an anchor of sanity in their chaotic existence. But even this simple pleasure had taken on sinister overtones, as Frank and Jimmy couldn't help but wonder if Ezra was preparing to use those weapons on them. The isolation of their mountain hideout had become both sanctuary and prison. While it protected them from immediate pursuit, it also cut them off from any news of the outside world, leaving them to imagine threats that might or might not exist. They didn't know if they were actively hunted or already forgotten, whether their crimes had made them notorious or merely added them to the long list of failed outlaws who had disappeared into the wilderness. Food was running dangerously low, their supplies depleted by months of hiding and their inability to venture into towns for resupply. They had been reduced to hunting small game with increasing desperation, their amateur skills as woodsmen no match for the harsh realities of mountain survival. The romantic image of outlaws living off the land had proven to be another dangerous fantasy, as they slowly starved in their supposed refuge. Frank found himself thinking more and more about his childhood, the simple farm life he had abandoned in pursuit of adventure and easy money. His mother's warnings about the company he kept echoed in his memory, her predictions of a bad end proving more accurate than any fortune teller. He wondered if she was still alive, if she ever thought about her wayward son, if she would even recognize the broken man he had become. The psychological pressure of their situation had begun manifesting in increasingly disturbing ways. Jimmy had started talking to himself in different voices, carrying on elaborate conversations with imaginary companions who seemed more real to him than his actual gang members. Ezra had developed tics and compulsions, counting his bullets obsessively and arranging their meager possessions in specific patterns that only he understood. Frank's own mental state was deteriorating rapidly, his thoughts becoming increasingly dark and fragmented. He found himself planning the murders of his remaining companions, imagining scenarios where he killed them in their sleep and took their shares of the money. The fact that these thoughts no longer horrified him was perhaps the most frightening development of all, a sign that whatever humanity he had possessed was finally dying. The irony wasn't lost on him that they had become everything they had once claimed to fight against. They were now the predators who terrorized innocent people, the source of fear and suffering in communities across the frontier. The noble outlaw mythology that had initially inspired them had revealed itself as a cruel joke, a seductive lie that led men to their destruction while convincing them they were heroes. Their legend, such as it was, would die with them in this frozen cabin, another cautionary tale lost to history. There would be no songs written about Frank Morrison and his gang, no dime novels celebrating their exploits, no romantic reimagining of their crimes. They would simply disappear into the vast indifference of the American wilderness, their bones eventually scattered by scavengers, their names forgotten by a world that had moved on without them. As Frank pulled his tattered coat tighter against the cold and listened to Jimmy's labored breathing in the darkness, he finally understood the true cost of the outlaw life. It wasn't just the risk of death or imprisonment that made it unbearable. It was the slow erosion of everything that made life worth living. They had traded their humanity for the illusion of freedom, and in the end, they had gained neither. The brutal mathematics of bandit life had finally balanced the books, and the price had been everything they were and everything they might have been. In the morning, if they lived to see it, they would wake up to face another day of the same grinding despair, another step closer to the inevitable end that awaited all those who chose the outlaw's path. The dream was over, and only the nightmare remained. Based on the script summary and reference materials, Here's part 11 of the series focusing on the psychological breakdown and approaching end of the bandit lifestyle. The months dragged on like a slow bleed, each day bleeding into the next in an endless parade of misery and mounting desperation. Frank Morrison had become something he barely recognized in the cracked mirror of his own consciousness, a hollow-eyed spectre haunted by choices that had led him down this godforsaken path. The romantic notions of outlaw life had been stripped away like flesh from bone, leaving only the grim skeleton of survival. Winter had arrived early that year, settling over the territory like a burial shroud. The gang, what remained of it, had holed up in an abandoned mine shaft 20 miles north of Tombstone, their breath forming ghostly clouds in the perpetual twilight of their underground refuge. The walls wept with moisture, and the constant drip, drip, drip of water hitting stone had become a maddening metronome, marking time until their inevitable end. They were down to 4 men now. Dutch had died 3 weeks prior, gut-shot during a botched robbery of a Wells Fargo office. They'd watched him writhe in agony for 2 days before infection took him, his screams echoing off the mine walls until Frank had seriously considered putting a bullet in his head as an act of mercy. Jimmy the Kid had simply vanished one morning, taking his horse and what little food they had left. Whether he'd abandoned them or been picked off by bounty hunters, no one knew, and no one much cared anymore. Frank's hands shook as he tried to roll a cigarette from the last pinch of tobacco they possessed. His fingers, once steady enough to thread a needle or pick a lock, now trembled like autumn leaves. The withdrawal from laudanum was eating him alive from the inside out, but the bottle had run dry weeks ago. Sleep brought no relief, only nightmares of the faces he'd killed, the families he'd destroyed, the innocent blood on his hands that no amount of washing could ever clean. "We can't stay here much longer," wheezed Tom Bradley, the former schoolteacher whose descent into criminality had been even more dramatic than Frank's own. Tom's cough had gotten worse, a wet, rattling sound that spoke of consumption. Blood flecked his lips when he spoke, and his once round face had become gaunt and hollow. "The Pinkertons know about this place. I can feel them circling like vultures." Frank nodded absently, his mind elsewhere. He'd been thinking about Sarah again, his wife, dead these many years from the fever. She'd been pregnant when she died, carrying their first child. He wondered sometimes what kind of man he might have become if she'd lived, if he'd had a reason to stay on the straight and narrow. But that was a luxury he couldn't afford anymore, wondering about what might have been. The past was a closed book, and the future looked increasingly unlikely. The 4th member of their pathetic band was a Mexican named Carlos, who spoke little English and had joined them after killing a sheriff's deputy in Tucson. He sat in the corner sharpening his knife obsessively, the scraping sound adding another layer to the symphony of despair that filled their makeshift hideout. His eyes had taken on the flat, empty look of a man who'd seen too much death and was ready to embrace it. Food was running dangerously low. They'd been reduced to eating the rats that scurried through the mine tunnels, roasting them over small fires that they dared only light at night. The meat was stringy and foul, but it was protein, and protein meant another day of survival. Frank had long since stopped being disgusted by what they'd been reduced to eating. Disgust was a luxury for men who still had their humanity intact. The psychological toll was perhaps worse than the physical hardships. Frank caught himself talking to people who weren't there. Sometimes Sarah, sometimes his long-dead father, sometimes the victims of his crimes who came to him in fevered visions demanding justice he could never provide. The line between waking and sleeping had become blurred, and reality felt increasingly negotiable. Tom's condition deteriorated daily. The consumption was winning its war against his weakened constitution, and Frank knew it was only a matter of time before they'd be digging another grave in the frozen ground outside the mine. The schoolteacher had been keeping a journal throughout their time as outlaws, documenting their gradual descent into hell with the methodical precision of a man recording a scientific experiment. Frank had read portions of it when Tom was sleeping, and the clinical detachment with which Tom described their crimes was more chilling than any scream of anguish. "Listen," Tom said during one of his lucid moments, blood staining his handkerchief as he wiped his mouth. "If I don't make it out of here, when I don't make it out of here, I want you to take my journal. Mail it to my sister in St. Louis. Let someone know what we became out here. Let them know the cost of this life." Frank wanted to tell him that no one would care, that decent society had written them off long ago as rabid dogs to be put down. But something in Tom's eyes, a desperate need for meaning, for some small redemption in the face of approaching death, stopped him. "I'll see it gets to her," Frank lied, knowing full well that Tom's journal would likely burn with everything else when the end came. The Pinkerton agents were indeed closing in. Frank could sense it in the way the local wildlife had gone quiet, in the subtle signs that experienced trackers left behind despite their best efforts at concealment. Alan Pinkerton's men were legendary for their persistence, and Frank knew that his gang's string of robberies and murders had made them a priority target. The agency's motto was, "We never sleep," and Frank had come to understand that this wasn't mere advertising. It was a promise and a threat. Carlos had started talking about making a run for the Mexican border, crossing into Sonora where American law couldn't follow. But Frank knew it was hopeless. They were too weak, too recognizable, too marked by their crimes to ever truly escape. The bounty on their heads had grown to a sum that would make any man rich for life, and there wasn't a town in the territory where their faces weren't known. The cold was becoming unbearable. Their stolen coats and blankets provided little protection against the mountain winter, and frostbite had claimed 2 of Frank's toes. He'd cut them off himself with a hunting knife, cauterizing the stumps with a heated iron. The pain had been excruciating, but infection would have been worse. He'd done the same for Carlos, who'd lost 3 fingers to the cold. They were being dismantled piece by piece, their bodies failing as surely as their spirits. One morning, Frank woke to find Tom Bradley dead, his journal clutched to his chest like a prayer book. The schoolteacher's face wore an expression of peace that Frank envied, finally free from the endless cycle of violence and fear that had consumed their lives. They wrapped him in a blanket and dragged him outside to a shallow grave, the frozen ground resisting their shovels like it was rejecting one more piece of evidence of their existence. With Tom's death, something fundamental broke inside Frank. The last connection to the man he'd once been, the man who'd believed in honor among thieves and the romance of the outlaw life, died with the consumptive schoolteacher. What remained was a creature driven purely by survival instinct, a predator so far removed from civilization that return was no longer possible. Carlos didn't last much longer. A week after Tom's burial, the Mexicans simply walked out into a blizzard and never came back. Frank found his body 3 days later, frozen solid against a pine tree, his dead eyes staring at something only he could see. Whether it had been suicide or simply the final surrender to forces beyond his control, Frank couldn't say. He didn't bother burying Carlos. The frozen corpse would keep until spring, and by then it wouldn't matter to anyone. Alone now in the mineshaft, Frank faced the terrible arithmetic of his situation. No allies, no resources, no hope of escape or redemption. The Pinkertons would find him eventually. It was just a matter of time. He could try to run, but where? Every town had a telegraph office. Every sheriff had his description. Every bounty hunter in the territory was looking for him. He was a walking dead man, a ghost haunting his own life. The hallucinations were getting worse. Sarah visited him nightly now, sometimes cradling the baby they'd never had, sometimes weeping over the man he'd become. His father appeared too, the stern preacher who'd tried to beat righteousness into his son's soul, shaking his head in disappointment at what his boy had become. The victims of Frank's crimes came as well. The bank clerk in Phoenix, the stagecoach passengers near Yuma, the sheriff's deputy in Tucson. They didn't speak, just stared at him with accusing eyes that followed him wherever he went. Food was gone entirely now. Frank had eaten the last rat 2 days ago, and his stomach cramped constantly with hunger. He tried chewing on leather from his gun belt, but it only made him sicker. His reflection in a puddle of mine water showed him a scarecrow of a man, hollow cheeks, wild hair, eyes that had seen too much death to ever find peace again. The sound of horses outside the mine entrance broke through his fevered thoughts. Multiple riders, moving with the careful precision of professional manhunters. Frank's hand went instinctively to his Colt, checking the cylinder. 3 bullets left. He'd been saving them, though he wasn't entirely sure what for. The arithmetic was simple enough. 3 bullets, however many Pinkertons were outside. The math didn't work in his favor. "Frank Morrison!" The voice echoed off the mine walls, amplified and distorted until it sounded like the voice of God himself calling down judgment. "This is Agent William Chambers of the Pinkerton Detective Agency. The mine is surrounded. Come out with your hands up and you'll get a fair trial." Frank almost laughed at that. A fair trial. As if there was any fairness left in a world that had stripped away everything decent and left only the brutal calculus of survival. He thought about Tom's journal, still clutched in his dead hands somewhere in the frozen ground outside. Someone should know what they'd become out here, what the cost of this life really was. But no one would care. The world had moved on without them, progressing toward a future where men like Frank Morrison were nothing more than cautionary tales told around campfires. The frontier was closing, the wild spaces shrinking, and there was no place left for the kind of man he'd become. The Pinkertons were patient. They'd wait him out, let hunger and cold do their work. They had supplies, reinforcements, time. Frank had 3 bullets and the growing certainty that his story was reaching its inevitable conclusion. The romantic mythology of the outlaw had been revealed as the lie it always was. There was no honor in this life, no glory, no redemption, only suffering and death, and the terrible weight of choices that could never be undone. As the sun set outside the mine entrance, painting the snow-covered ground in shades of blood and gold, Frank Morrison sat in the darkness and contemplated the end of his journey. The boy who'd dreamed of adventure and freedom was long dead, killed by degrees in a dozen unnamed camps and hideouts across the territory. What remained was something less than human, a cautionary tale written in scars and desperation. The wind howled through the mine shaft, carrying with it the voices of the dead and the promise of judgment to come. Frank closed his eyes and waited for whatever ending awaited him in the darkness, knowing that the brutal life of a bandit in the Wild West had finally extracted its ultimate price, not just his life, but his very soul. So as the bandit's tale draws to a close, we see that survival in the Wild West was often a desperate choice between poverty and peril. These outlaws weren't the romanticized heroes of Hollywood films, but rather desperate men driven to violence by circumstance, living brutal lives that usually ended in violent deaths. While their legends may have grown over time, the reality was far grimmer than any dime novel could capture. Their stories serve as a stark reminder of a lawless era when justice was scarce and survival came at the highest price. Until next time, rest well knowing you live in gentler times than these forgotten souls of the frontier.
golden